Prologue. Simon could not hold back his tears. It wasn't a weakness he had indulged since he was a boy, but tears threatened to unman him now. He turned and faced his comrades, and one in particular. "This is your doing, Shalimar? Your damned fault," he said between clenched teeth. He pulled a dagger clear of its scabbard and hurled it at her feet. The weapon bit deep into the still charred ground inches from her ankle. Suddenly, the groans and terrified cries of children filled the air, borne on a gust of wind that swept the din up through the valley ridge where the band of warriors had gathered. Smoke and the reek of putrid death hung heavy in the air. Most of the cries and blood-curdling pleas for mercy had faded. Only the whimpering sobs of the dying and maimed remained. Dozens of the slain seemed to have been dispatched while in a state of prostration. They died as they prayed. Clearly, the absence of any weapons in the vicinity of the victims indicated they had offered no armed resistance. It was a wholesale slaughter of simple people. A masjid set ablaze collapsed under the weight of its charred timbers as it belched black smoke into the putrid night air, a passing wind fanning the flames higher still. The scent of roasted flesh remained like a hideous vulture presiding over the carnage. She ignored the dagger thrown by the man with long white hair and strode out to the ridge overlooking what remained of the refugee town, once known as Salama al-Atfal, a haven for 500 children fleeing from neighboring towns and villages laid waste by the warlord and his men. Under the protection of the Dark Eternals, the tall swordswoman tightly gripped the pommel of her sword and swallowed hard. She removed her helm and ran her gloved hand over her bald head. Her lean, angular features and high cheekbones gleamed with sweat. No words came to her throat. Instead, she began to tremble in the hot night air. She sank to her knees. It was not the weight of her armor, nor the sagging burden of her sword or spear or shield that bent her. It was bitter shame. A third figure, a smaller woman, equally clad in gleaming armor and decked with elaborate quiver and bow, knelt beside her. "You see the price of vanity, Shalimar. I told you. I tried to warn you, but you would hear none of it. Your noble blood was all that mattered to you. Now look where it has led us. These people begged for our help, and this is how we answer their call. All because you wanted to entertain a legend now, most certainly dead? Well, you can choke on it now. The wise say legends are forged in blood and tears, and you are indeed awash with both. Luckily for you, it is not your own, but I suppose that is all that matters." Kaleka held her tongue. Anger threatened to get the better of her otherwise cool head, and she feared saying that which could not be taken back. But perhaps that time had already passed. Shalimar bowed her head, and the words of her father came thundering back to her. The sword arm of the warrior is only as strong as his faith in Allah. How those words choked her now, the Eternals. It was a legacy 200 years in the making, a mantle they had donned in a long line of warriors. They were young soldiers then, who had won the admiration of the Sultan and quickly became an unstoppable force for good. Filled with the fervor of youth, they had become his honor guard, tasked with protecting the realm, a realm that spanned 3 continents and then the new Eternals. But that was 10 years ago. Now, as youthfulness had waned, so too had the naivety that spurred them on. Too many campaigns, too much loss, and too much blood had jaded the youngsters into hardened warriors who increasingly questioned the difference between right and wrong and seemed to dwell too often in the murky gray matter that separated the two. There were 4 Emir Eternals, each charged with a cadre of 10,000 soldiers. Simon, the Emir of Spears, Kaleka, the bow mistress, Burak, man of the mallet, and lastly Shalimar, the niece of a noble general in a long line of scholars dedicated to the prophetic codification of war. Simon nodded to his young aide Shahid, who pulled out a elegantly curved ovis and brass horn and blew a long mournful refrain. From behind the small group, a gathered column of 2,000 soldiers descended into the valley. They quickly fanned out, aiding the wounded and dying. High on the hill behind them, forever keeping watch, were the dreaded iron-clad regiment, silent as the stillest night.